Okay guys, here are the notes for section P.5, and you're going to get that worksheet tomorrow. That's going to be about solving quadratics. Okay, solving quadratic equations. There's 4 ways we're going to talk about. The first is factoring, solving a quadratic by factoring. The second is by completing the square. Third, take the square root of both sides. And 4, using the quadratic formula. So let's do an example of each. First, we're going to solve by factoring. So this equation is 2x squared plus 5x minus 3 equals 0. The first thing we want to do is we want to identify what a, b, and c are. A is the number in front of x squared, so that's 2. B is the number in front of x, so that's 5. And c is the constant term, which is negative 3. Now, I'm not sure how you guys learned how to factor in the past. The way that I've always done it is I've made a chart. Okay, 3 columns. On top, I'm going to put whatever a times c is. Okay, so 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. And then whatever the b term is goes over here in the 3rd column, and that's 5. So what we need is we need 2 numbers that multiply to negative 6. So I need 2 numbers that multiply, excuse my scribbling, to negative 6 and add to 5. Okay? So the same 2 numbers have to multiply to negative 6 and add to 5. So if we look at it, if we do negative 1 and 6, negative 1 times 6 is negative 6, negative 1 plus 6 is 5. So these 2 numbers work out for us. Now, if a was 1, if a was just 1, we could factor it right now, put in parentheses x minus 1, x plus 6, and we would be done. Okay? But a is not 1. So what we have to do is we have to rewrite the equation. So separate this out here. So I have 2x squared. Now, instead of the middle term plus 5x, instead of writing that, what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite it using the 2 terms here that we found in the table. Because if you put those 2 terms together, you're still going to get plus 5x. So we're just going to rewrite the middle. Now, what I always do is I look at the 2 numbers and I say, okay, which one of those 2 numbers goes better with 2x squared? Just by factor-wise and everything. Well, 6 does. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the 6 right here, plus 6x. And then the minus 1 is going to come right here, minus 1x. So now I come back up to my equation. I put minus 3 equals 0. Okay? So now, to factor the rest of this, I'm going to take the first 2 terms, and I'm going to factor out the common factors. So the common factor of 2 and 6 is 2. There's an x squared and an x, so I can take out an x. Here, let me erase that and make that a little clearer for everybody. So I can factor out a 2x. Now, what's left? 2x out of 2x squared is just x. If I take 2x out of 6x, I just get plus 3. Now I look at the second group of terms, negative 1x and negative 3. Well, the only thing I can factor out is a negative 1. So I factor out negative 1, and I get x plus 3. And again, I got to put the equals 0 down here, kind of cramped for space. All right? When you factor out a term, guys, what you're doing is you're just dividing each term by that greatest common factor. So negative 1x divided by negative 1 is x. Negative 3 divided by negative 1 is positive 3. Now, notice, the 2 parentheses here are the same. That's what we want. We want those parentheses to be the same. So that means that x plus 3 is one of our factors. The other factor is the 2 terms that we factored out. Put those together. Oh, that should be a minus 1. Oops. Okay. Now remember, this equals 0, so when you factor it, you're not done. You have to solve it. So what you do is you take each factor and you set it equal to 0. So minus 3 to both sides. X equals negative 3 is a solution. Add 1 to both sides. So 2x equals 1. Divide by 2. X equals 1/2. Now, you should get 2 answers for all these, so I mean, that's what you should expect to get. But that's how you solve by factoring. Okay? Now, let's solve by taking the square root of both sides. Now, before you take the square root of both sides, in this case we have a parenthesis squared. We want to get the parenthesis squared by itself first, before we start taking square roots. So I have u plus 1 quantity squared equals 18 over 4. Now, you can divide 18 by 4 and write 4.5. That's certainly up to you if you want to do that. I'm going to leave it as a fraction for right now. Once the parenthesis squared is by itself, and by the way, if you had something like this, okay, where there's no parentheses squared and just a variable squared, you would do the same thing. Get the variable squared by itself. Once the variable squared or the parentheses squared is by itself, now we can take the square root of both sides. So when you take the square root of a parentheses squared, you just get what was left underneath. On the right-hand side, it's going to be plus or minus, because remember, if you take a negative term and square it, it's still positive. So you have to account for the negative. Plus or minus the square root of 18 over 2. Because the square root of 18, we don't know that. That's a decimal. But the square root of 4 on the bottom is 2. Okay? Now, we can reduce the square root of 18 to the square root of 9 and the square root of 2. So this is really plus or minus 3 radical 2 over 2. Because we reduced radical 18 down to simplest radical form. Well, now we have to subtract 1 to both sides to get the u by itself. So I'm running out of room. Sorry, guys. U equals negative 1. Put the negative 1 first. I always put the plus or minus in the middle. I never put it out front. So put the negative 1 in front, then plus or minus 3 radical 2 over 2. And that's 2 answers in 1, because negative 1 plus 3 radical 2 over 2 is an answer. Negative 1 minus 3 radical 2 over 2 is another answer. So it's really 2 answers in 1. The plus or minus gets you there. Okay? So that's solving by taking the square root. Now, completing the square. The first thing we want to do in completing the square is we want to get the equation to equal 0 if it is not already. So if it already equals 0, there's no work to do. But in this case, we have work to do. So we have to move the 4 over, and we have to move the minus 6x over. So when we do that, we're going to get x squared plus 6x minus 4. Okay? Now, if the number in front of x squared isn't 1, in this case it is, so we're okay. But if it isn't 1, then what we want to do is we want to divide all the terms by that number. Now, we don't have to do that here. But to complete the square, there has to be a 1 in front of the x squared. So what we do is this. Actually, we should have kept that 4 on the other side, but that's okay. Let's bring it back over. That's my fault. Leave that constant term on the other side. Because what we want to do is we want to take this plus 6, and we want to divide it by 2, and then we want to take that number and we want to square it. And then when we do that, we get plus 9 on the we get plus 9. You add it. So regardless of what that sign is, now it's a plus sign, so it doesn't matter, but we take half of 6 and make it 3. We square it and make it 9. Now it's an equation, right? So when we add 9 to one side, we have to add 9 to the other side. So now I have 13 equals. Now, complete the square means we want to find this number at the end such that I can write a parenthesis squared. So in this case, this is x plus 3 quantity squared, because it's actually this number that's going to go in the parentheses right there. Okay? But you have to have the plus 9 at the end, because that's what you're going to add to the left side as well. Well, your parenthesis squared is by itself, so now we take the square root of both sides. I have plus or minus radical 13 equals x plus 3. Subtract 3 to both sides. So now the final answer is x equals negative 3 plus or minus radical 13. Now if you want to write that as a decimal, if you want to do negative 3 plus that and negative 3 minus that and write two separate answers, you're certainly free to do so. Okay, but that is the basic method for completing the square. Quadratic formula. Quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root, b squared minus 4ac, running out of room, over 2a. So, a is 2, b is negative 3, and c is 1. So now it's just a case of plugging it in. So the opposite of b, this minus b right here, stands for the opposite of b. b is negative 3, so when we put it in the formula, it's positive 3. It's the opposite. Plus or minus the square root, b squared, so that's negative 3 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 1, over 2 times a is 2. So that's the numbers plugged into the quadratic formula. Now we have to simplify. So 3 plus or minus the square root, negative 3 squared is 9, minus 4 times 2 times 1 is minus 8, divided by 4. Well, this works out really well because x equals 3 plus or minus 9 minus 8 is 1. The square root of 1 is 1 over 4. Now, when there's no radicals, when it's all whole numbers like this, we can just figure it out. We don't have to just leave it in radical form. 3 plus 1 is 4, divided by 4 is 1. 3 minus 1 is 2. 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. So here are our two answers. Okay, quadratic formula is easy. You just have to figure out what a, b, and c are and plug them in. Now again, if this equation did not equal 0, if you had x's on both sides or terms on both sides, you would have to get all the terms on one side, let it equal, and make sure it equals 0, then you could do the quadratic formula. Discriminant. The discriminant tells how many and what kind of zeros there are. The formula for discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. So in other words, it's what's underneath the square root sign in the quadratic formula. If b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, then what that means is there are two real number roots, or zeros. Roots and zeros means the same thing. If b squared minus 4ac equals 0, then there is one real root, only one, because you get the square root of 0, which goes away. So then you'd only have a 1 fraction, and that would be the one real root. If b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, then there are two imaginary roots, because what would happen is that you'd have the square root of a negative number. And last year in Honors Algebra 2, you learned that if you have a square root of a negative number, that's just going to be an I. So for example, if you had the square root of negative 9, that would be 3i. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of negative 1 is I. Okay? So just a little example there for the imaginaries. And that's it. This information should be very helpful to you as you do the worksheet tomorrow. Make sure you watch this, take notes, and we'll go over a little bit of this tomorrow, and then you'll be off and going on section P.5. All right? Thanks, guys.